In the winter of 1841, the farmers of Salem County, New Jersey, began whispering about the boy who appeared at their doors like a ghost from a snowstorm, small, fragile, with the face of a child no older than 12. He would beg for shelter, his voice trembling with cold and desperation. What they didn't know was that Joshua Bennett had been 12 years old for 20 years, and behind those innocent blue eyes lay the calculating mind of a predator who had perfected the art of exploiting Christian charity. By the time the killing began, 7 families had already lost everything they owned, and the boy who never grew had vanished into the New Jersey wilderness like smoke. Before we continue with the story of Joshua Bennett and the terror that gripped Salem County, if you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We love connecting with our audience across America. Now, let's uncover the chilling truth about the predator who hid behind a child's face. The Salem County of 1841 was a patchwork of modest farms and tight-knit communities scattered across the flat, fertile plains of southern New Jersey. Unlike its infamous namesake in Massachusetts, this Salem was a place where Quaker traditions ran deep, where the monthly meetings still governed community life with an iron hand wrapped in gentle words. The county's 20,000 residents lived by the rhythms of harvest and prayer, their wooden farmhouses connected by muddy roads that became impassable lakes during the harsh winters. It was a land shaped by immigration and faith. German Lutheran families worked side by side with English Quakers, while Irish Catholics clustered around the growing industrial towns along the Delaware River. The Mexican-American War had just ended, bringing a sense of national triumph, but also economic uncertainty. As veterans returned home to find their jobs taken by eager immigrants, families hoarded their savings in mason jars, buried in root cellars, or hidden behind loose floorboards, trusting banks about as much as they trusted politicians. The Hartwell family exemplified this cautious prosperity. Samuel Hartwell, a weathered man of 43, had spent 15 years transforming 60 acres of stubborn clay into profitable farmland. His wife, Patience, bore the stern beauty common to Quaker women, her graying hair always perfectly contained beneath her plain bonnet. Their 3 children, Martha, 15, Thomas, 13, and little Rebecca, 8, had known nothing but the security of their father's careful planning and their mother's unwavering faith. Samuel's success came from more than just hard work. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to predict weather patterns, knowing exactly when to plant, when to harvest, and when to sell his grain at the market in Salem City. His neighbors often joked that Samuel could smell money in the wind, and they weren't entirely wrong. By the autumn of 1841, the Hartwells had accumulated nearly $400, a fortune that could buy a man's freedom or destroy his family, depending on who discovered it. That October, as the leaves turned the color of dried blood and the first frost warnings sent farmers scrambling to protect their crops, strange stories began circulating through the county's churches and meeting houses. Families spoke in hushed tones about a peculiar boy who had begun appearing at farmhouse doors, always alone, always just as darkness fell. He was small and pale, with startling blue eyes and hair so light it seemed almost white in the lamplight. Most disturbing of all, he never seemed to age, leading some to whisper about supernatural explanations they dared not voice aloud. But Joshua Bennett was entirely human and infinitely more dangerous than any ghost. Born in 1809 in the Pine Barrens of central New Jersey, he had stopped growing at the age of 12 due to a rare condition that modern medicine might recognize, but 1840s physicians dismissed as constitutional weakness. By 32, he stood barely 4 feet tall, his face frozen in perpetual youth, while his mind had acquired 3 decades of bitter experience. Joshua had discovered his gift, if one could call it that, during the Panic of 1837, when economic collapse left thousands of families destitute, desperate, and starving. He had approached a Methodist family in Trenton, claiming to be an orphan child whose parents had died of cholera. The family, moved by Christian duty and his pitiful appearance, had taken him in for 3 weeks before he vanished with their life savings and their grandmother's silver jewelry. The experience had been a revelation. People saw only what they expected to see, and what they expected to see was a helpless child in need of protection. Over the next 4 years, Joshua had refined his methods with scientific precision. He learned to modulate his voice to sound younger, to effect a slight stutter that made him seem more vulnerable, and to study his marks for weeks before approaching them. He became an expert in the religious and social customs of each community, knowing exactly which biblical verses to quote and which personal tragedies to fabricate. Most importantly, he learned patience, the ability to spend months earning a family's complete trust before striking. The technique was devastatingly effective. Joshua would appear at a farmhouse during a storm or on a particularly cold night, his small frame shivering beneath inadequate clothes. He claimed to be the sole survivor of various tragedies: a house fire that killed his parents, a cholera outbreak that wiped out his family, Indian raids that left him wandering the wilderness. The details always changed, but the effect remained the same. Christian families bound by their faith to care for orphans and strangers would welcome him into their homes without question. Once inside, Joshua became the perfect houseguest. He helped with chores, attended family prayers with evident devotion, and charmed children with stories and simple magic tricks. Parents marveled at his maturity and good manners, attributing his wisdom to the hardships he had supposedly endured. Meanwhile, Joshua cataloged every detail of their lives: where they kept their money, what valuables they owned, which family members might pose a threat to his plans. The robberies themselves were masterpieces of misdirection. Joshua would wait for the perfect opportunity. A night when the father was away on business or the family attended a lengthy church service, he would take only cash and easily portable valuables, careful to leave behind anything that might be quickly missed. By the time the theft was discovered, usually days or even weeks later, the orphan boy they had sheltered was miles away, having spun some tale about finding distant relatives or being called to join another family. But Salem County would prove different here. Joshua Bennett would finally encounter people who refused to let him simply disappear into the darkness, and his carefully controlled world of deception would begin to unravel in ways he could never have anticipated. November brought an early winter to Salem County, with temperatures plummeting and snow falling and heavy wet curtains that turned the roads into muddy rivers. It was on such a night, November 18, 1841, that Joshua Bennett first appeared at the Hartwell farm, materializing out of the storm like something conjured from the darkness itself. Samuel Hartwell was checking on his livestock when he heard the faint knocking at the front door, barely audible above the howling wind that rattled the windows and sent tree branches scraping against the roof. When he opened the door, his lantern revealed a sight that would haunt him for months to come. A small boy, perhaps 12 years old, standing in the swirling snow with his arms wrapped around his thin chest. The child's lips were blue with cold, his clothes soaked through and clinging to his small frame. Most unsettling were his eyes, an almost unnatural shade of pale blue that seemed to reflect the lantern light like chips of ice. "Please, sir," the boy whispered, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "I've been walking for days. My family, they're all dead, sir. The fever took them." His words came out in short, panting breaths, punctuated by violent shivering that made his entire body tremble. Patience Hartwell appeared beside her husband, her face immediately softening at the sight of the child. "Samuel, bring him inside this instant. The poor thing will freeze to death on our doorstep." Her voice carried the authority of a woman accustomed to managing both household and children, and Samuel stepped aside to let the boy enter. The warmth of the Hartwell home seemed to revive the stranger almost instantly. Color returned to his cheeks as he stood before the crackling fireplace, steam rising from his damp clothes. The children gathered around him with the curiosity natural to youth, while Patience bustled about, preparing hot soup and finding dry clothing that might fit their unexpected guest. "What's your name, child?" Patience asked, kneeling beside him with maternal concern. "Joseph, Mom. Joseph Crawford." "Joseph." The name rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, and he managed a shy smile that made him appear even younger. "I come from down near Millville. My pa had a small farm there, but the lung fever came through in September. Took Ma first, then my little sister Sarah, then Pa." His voice broke convincingly on the last word, and little Rebecca Hartwell reached out to pat his shoulder in sympathy. Over the following days, Joshua, now Joseph, settled into the Hartwell household with remarkable ease. He proved himself useful around the farm, feeding chickens with careful attention and helping Thomas with his daily chores. During family prayers each morning and evening, he recited biblical verses with a piety that impressed even stern Samuel, who had begun life as a skeptical convert to the Quaker faith. But it was during the quiet evening hours, when the family gathered around the fireplace for conversation and simple entertainments, that Joshua truly excelled. He possessed an uncanny ability to read people's emotions and respond with exactly the right word or gesture. When Martha seemed melancholy about a boy who had stopped calling, Joshua offered innocent but insightful observations about young men's ficklessness that made her laugh. When Thomas struggled with his arithmetic lessons, The younger boy somehow managed to help without making it obvious that his mathematical skills far exceeded what one might expect from a 12-year-old orphan. Most importantly, Joshua studied the Hartwell family's routines and secrets with the intensity of a scholar. He noted that Samuel counted the money in his iron strongbox every Sunday after church, that the key hung on a nail behind the pickle barrel in the root cellar, and that Patience kept her grandmother's gold locket in a small wooden box beneath her undergarments in the bedroom chest. He observed which neighbors visited regularly, which days Samuel traveled to market, and how long it took for sounds from the barn to carry to the house. 3 weeks into his stay, Joshua felt confident enough to begin testing the family's trust. He started small, borrowing a few pennies from Martha's small collection, and watching to see if their absence was noticed. When no questions arose, he grew bolder, taking a silver thimble from Patient's sewing basket and hiding it among his own meager possessions. Still, no alarm was raised. The Hartwells had so completely accepted him as family that they no longer kept mental inventories of their belongings in his presence. The opportunity Joshua had been waiting for came on December 14th, a bitter cold Sunday when the ground was frozen solid and the wind cut through even the thickest wool coats. Samuel had planned to attend the monthly business meeting of the Salem Friends, a journey that would keep him away from home until well after dark. Patience, fighting a persistent cough that had lingered since Thanksgiving, decided to remain home with the children rather than risk the cold journey to meeting. But fate, or Joshua's careful planning, intervened. Little Rebecca developed a fierce fever during the night, her temperature climbing so high that she began speaking nonsense and seeing things that weren't there. By morning, her condition had worsened to the point that Patience feared for her daughter's life. Samuel's meeting would have to wait. The child needed immediate attention from Dr. Marcus Fleming in Salem City, the only physician within 20 miles who had any real skill treating childhood fevers. Joseph, you'll need to help me harness the wagon, Samuel told Joshua as he prepared for the emergency journey. We'll take Rebecca to the doctor and Patience can rest at her sister's house while we wait for the fever to break. The plan was sound, but it would leave Martha and Thomas alone at the farm with Joshua. Exactly the scenario he had been hoping to create. As the wagon disappeared down the muddy lane, Joshua felt the familiar thrill of anticipation that always preceded his carefully orchestrated thefts. Martha had been instructed to prepare supper for when the family returned, while Thomas was expected to complete his delayed chores in the barn. This would give Joshua at least 2 hours of relative privacy to access Samuel's strongbox and select the most valuable portable items from the house. He waited until he was certain both teenagers were occupied before slipping into the root cellar. The iron key hung exactly where he had observed it. Cold to the touch and slightly rusty from the damp air, the strongbox itself sat on a wooden shelf between sacks of potatoes and preserved vegetables, its weight suggesting the substantial fortune he had suspected the Hartwells possessed. Inside, Joshua discovered more wealth than he had dared hope. Nearly $400 in gold and silver coins carefully separated into small leather pouches, several land deeds that might be valuable to the right buyer, a collection of promissory notes from neighbors who owed Samuel money from various business dealings, most surprising of all, a small diary written in Samuel's careful hand, documenting not just family events, but also detailed observations about his neighbors' financial situations, information that could prove invaluable to someone in Joshua's line of work. Joshua selected approximately half the coins, reasoning that the partial theft might go unnoticed longer than a complete cleaning out. He also took 2 of the smaller land deeds and several of the more recent promissory notes, items that Samuel might assume he had simply misplaced. As an afterthought, he pocketed the diary, intrigued by its potential intelligence value for future operations in the area. The selection of household valuables required more careful consideration. Patience's gold locket was an obvious choice, along with a small silver picture frame that contained a daguerreotype of Samuel's deceased parents. From Martha's room, he took a pearl brooch that had belonged to her grandmother, and from the kitchen, a set of silver spoons that were probably the most valuable items in the house. Joshua had just finished secreting his selections in a canvas bag hidden beneath his straw mattress when he heard Thomas calling from the yard. "Joseph, come help me with this gate latch. It's frozen solid, and I can't manage it alone." The interruption was unexpected but not alarming. Joshua composed his features into the innocent expression of a helpful child and hurried outside to assist Thomas with his chores. As they worked together to free the stubborn gate, Joshua found himself studying the older boy with new interest. Thomas Hartwell was small for his age, but possessed the wiry strength common to farm children. More importantly, he had inherited his father's sharp eyes and suspicious nature. traits that might make him dangerous if he ever began to question Joshua's story. "You know, Joseph," Thomas said as they wrestled with the frozen metal, "you're awfully strong for someone who's been sick and traveling for so long. And you sure do know a lot about farming for a boy who says his family only had a small plot." Joshua's blood chilled, but he maintained his innocent demeanor. "I reckon hard times make you grow up fast," he replied, affecting the slight stutter he used when he wanted to seem more vulnerable. "And he taught me everything he could before the fever took him." Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied. But Joshua noticed the boy's eyes lingered on him with uncommon intensity. For the first time since arriving at the Hartwell farm, Joshua felt the faint stirring of genuine concern. If Thomas had begun to suspect something, the entire operation might be in jeopardy. That evening, when the family returned with Rebecca's fever finally broken and the child sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, Joshua felt both relief and mounting urgency. He had successfully completed the theft phase of his plan, but Thomas's questions had introduced an element of unpredictability that made him eager to conclude his business with the Hartwells as quickly as possible. The theft went unnoticed for nearly a week. Samuel Hartwell, exhausted from nursing Rebecca through her illness and managing the additional expenses of Dr. Tech Fleming's treatments, didn't conduct his usual Sunday count of the strongbox contents. Patients, meanwhile, attributed the missing household items to simple misplacement during the confusion of their daughter's sickness. It wasn't until December 22nd, when Samuel needed to access his emergency funds to purchase additional medication for Rebecca's lingering cough, that the crime was discovered. The discovery came at the worst possible moment. Samuel had invited his brother-in-law, Ezra Thornton, and Ezra's family to spend Christmas week at the farm. Ezra, a successful merchant from Philadelphia, had always harbored barely concealed skepticism about Samuel's claims of prosperity, and the planned visit was partly intended to demonstrate the Hartwell's financial stability. When Samuel opened his strong box to count out money for the doctor and found nearly half his fortune missing, the humiliation was compounded by having to explain the theft to a man who already considered him naive and careless. "Nearly $200, Samuel." Ezra's voice carried the tone of a man who had suspected such misfortune all along. "And you say nothing else appears to be missing from the house." But even as Samuel protested that Patience's jewelry and the household valuables seemed untouched, both women began conducting more thorough inventories of their possessions. The extent of the theft became clear only gradually, as each family member discovered that items they had assumed were temporarily misplaced were in fact gone forever. "The silver spoons," Patience said, her voice hollow with realization, "and my grandmother's locket, even Martha's pearl brooch." She sank into her rocking chair, the weight of violations settling over her like a burial shroud. "Someone has been through our entire house, Samuel. Someone who knew exactly what we owned and where to find it." The family's immediate suspicion fell on the various workers and neighbors who had access to the property. Samuel made discreet inquiries among his hired hands, while Martha and Thomas questioned the neighbor children who sometimes helped with chores. But each potential suspect had solid alibis for the days when the theft must have occurred, and none possessed the intimate knowledge of the household that the crime clearly required. It was Thomas who first voiced the suspicion that would change everything. "What about Joseph?" he asked during a family conference held while the boy was supposedly napping in the barn loft. "He's been here for over a month. He knows where everything is kept." Samuel's immediate reaction was indignation. "Thomas Hartwell, I'm ashamed to hear such words from your mouth. That boy has been nothing but helpful and grateful for our kindness." The idea that a child who lost everything would steal from the family that saved his life. "But that's just it, Thomas interrupted, his young voice carrying an adult certainty. "What if he didn't lose everything? What if the whole story about his family dying was just a lie to get us to trust him?" The conversation might have ended there, dismissed as the cruel suspicions of a jealous child. Except for Ezra's intervention, the Philadelphia merchant possessed a businessman's instinct for deception, and Thomas's suggestion triggered memories of stories he had heard from other merchants. Tales of confidence men who used disguises and false identities to prey on trusting families. "Let me make some inquiries," Ezra said quietly. "I have contacts throughout southern New Jersey. If this Joseph Crawford existed, if there really was a farm family by that name near Millville who died of fever, someone will remember." While Ezra began his investigation, Joshua sensed the growing tension in the household. The adult spoke in whispers that stopped abruptly when he entered rooms, and Thomas watched him with undisguised suspicion. Most troubling of all, Samuel had begun locking the root cellar and carrying the strongbox key on his person, a precaution that suggested the family's trust was eroding rapidly. Joshua realized his time at the Hartwell farm was drawing to a close. He began preparing for departure, constructing a plausible story about distant relatives who had been located and were expecting him to join them in Pennsylvania. But before he could implement his exit strategy, Ezra returned from Salem City with information that shattered any hope of a peaceful resolution. There was no Crawford family near Millville, Ezra announced during another private family conference. I spoke with the postmaster, the preacher, and 2 different merchants who travel that area regularly. No farm family by that name died of fever this autumn. In fact, no significant fever outbreak occurred in Cumberland County at all this year. The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by Patient's sharp intake of breath and Rebecca's innocent question. Does this mean Joseph lied to us? But it was Martha who provided the most damning evidence. I have been thinking about his stories, she said slowly. Remember how he said his little sister Sarah died first? But yesterday when he was playing with Rebecca, he accidentally called her Sarah. When I asked about it, he said she reminded him of his dead sister. But the way he said it, it was like he had forgotten Sarah was supposed to be dead. Samuel's face had gone pale. The implications of his family's discoveries settling over him like a gathering storm. You're saying this boy, this child we fed and sheltered and treated as our own, has been deliberately deceiving us. That he's some kind of criminal. The word hung in the air like an accusation. None of them could quite accept that they had been so thoroughly fooled by someone who appeared to be barely 12 years old. Yet the evidence was mounting steadily, and each new revelation made Joshua's guilt seem more certain. That night, as Joshua lay in his bed, listening to the muffled voices of the family conference continuing downstairs, he began planning what might be his most audacious escape yet. He still had the stolen money and valuables hidden beneath his mattress, but retrieving them without detection would require perfect timing. More challenging still, he would need to leave in such a way that the family couldn't immediately pursue him or alert the authorities to his true identity. The solution, when it came to him, was elegant in its simplicity. He would stage his own abduction. On the morning of December 27, 1841, Joshua Bennett implemented the most elaborate deception of his criminal career. He woke before dawn and carefully arranged his bedding to suggest a violent struggle, scattering straw from his mattress and leaving one of his boots near the door as if it had been lost during a kidnapping. Using a sharp piece of broken pottery found in the yard, he inflicted a shallow cut on his own arm, letting enough blood drop onto the floor to suggest injury without seriously harming himself. Most cleverly of all, Joshua composed a ransom note using words cut from a month-old newspaper that Ezra had brought from Philadelphia. The message was brief but effective. We have the boy, $50 in gold. Leave at the old mill ruins tomorrow night. Come alone or he dies. He deliberately made several spelling errors and used crude grammar to disguise his educated handwriting, then planted the note where Samuel would discover it when he came to wake Joshua for morning chores. The plan worked perfectly. Samuel's shouts of alarm brought the entire household running to the barn where they found the staged scene of violence and the terrifying ransom demand. In the chaos that followed, no one thought to conduct an immediate search of the property. By the time the family had contacted neighbors and organized a proper search party, Joshua was already 3 miles away, carrying his stolen fortune and traveling toward the Camden Ferry crossing. But Joshua had underestimated both the Hartwell family's determination and Ezra Thornton's connections in the business community. Instead of simply paying the ransom, Samuel chose to contact the Salem County Sheriff, a man named Caleb Hendris, who possessed both intelligence and experience in dealing with confidence schemes. Sheriff Ricks immediately recognized the kidnapping as a likely ruse, pointing out that real kidnappers rarely announce their crimes with elaborate ransom notes. This whole business smells like a confidence game. Ricks told the assembled family. That boy, if he's even a boy, has been playing you for fools from the beginning. The kidnapping story is just his way of disappearing without you realizing he was the thief all along. More damaging still, Ezra had begun making inquiries among his merchant contacts throughout New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania. What he discovered was a pattern of similar crimes stretching back nearly 4 years, always involving a small childlike figure who claimed to be an orphan, always targeting prosperous rural families with strong religious convictions, and always ending with mysterious disappearances and substantial thefts. There's a family in Hunterdon County who lost over $100 to someone matching this description, Ezra reported, and another near Trenton who had jewelry stolen by an orphan boy who vanished one night claiming he'd been called to join relatives. The pattern is identical, Samuel. We've been harboring a professional criminal. The revelation that their Joseph Crawford was likely a wanted thief rather than a kidnapping victim transformed the family's anguish into cold fury. Samuel Hartwell, a man whose Quaker faith preached forgiveness and understanding, found himself consumed with a desire for justice that bordered on vengeance. He authorized Sheriff Fricks to organize a manhunt covering 3 counties, and he personally offered a $50 reward for information leading to Joshua's capture. Ironically, the same amount demanded in the fake ransom note. Meanwhile, Joshua had reached Camden and crossed the Delaware River into Philadelphia, where he intended to disappear into the anonymous crowds of the city. But his distinctive appearance, which had been such an advantage in rural areas, now worked against him. Philadelphia was a city where missing children were taken seriously, and a boy traveling alone with a suspicious amount of money quickly attracted official attention. Joshua's first mistake came when he attempted to purchase passage on a stagecoach to Baltimore. The ticket agent, a suspicious man named Murphy, who had heard too many tales of runaway apprentices and kidnapped children, questioned why a boy was traveling alone with gold coins rather than the paper currency more commonly used for legitimate transactions. "And where might your parents be, young fellow?" Murphy asked, his Irish accent thickening with suspicion. "It's not often we see children your age traveling without family, especially carrying the kind of money you're flashing about." Joshua's carefully prepared story about visiting relatives fell apart under Murphy's persistent questioning. When the agent discovered that Joshua couldn't provide any verifiable details about his supposed destination or family connections, he refused to sell the ticket and threatened to contact the city constables. Forced to flee the stagecoach station, Joshua found himself trapped in a city he didn't know, carrying a fortune that he couldn't safely spend. Every attempt to purchase food or lodging resulted in suspicious questions about his age, his family, and his source of funds. Worse still, word was beginning to spread through the criminal networks that frequented Philadelphia's taverns and boarding houses. Talk of a boy who might be carrying a substantial amount of stolen money. Someone who might be worth robbing. It was in a waterfront tavern called the Anchor and Chain that Joshua first encountered Marcus Doyle, a man whose reputation for violence was matched only by his skill at extracting information from reluctant subjects. Doyle had heard whispers about the boy with the gold coins, and his practiced eye immediately recognized Joshua as someone playing a dangerous game far beyond his apparent years. "You're not from Philadelphia," Doyle observed, settling uninvited at Joshua's table. "And you're not as young as you're pretending to be. The question is, what's a grown man doing in a boy's body? And where did he get the kind of money that's got half the thieves in the city talking?" The confrontation forced Joshua to make a critical decision. He could attempt to flee Philadelphia immediately, risking capture by the authorities, who were certainly watching the major transportation routes. Or he could trust Doyle with at least part of the truth. Hoping to gain an ally who might help him establish a new identity and escape route, Joshua chose to gamble on Doyle's criminal instincts. Over the course of several hours, he revealed his true age and the general nature of his confidence schemes, though he carefully omitted specific details about the Hartwell family and the recent theft. Doyle listened with the calculating attention of a man evaluating a potential business partnership. "You've got a gift," Doyle admitted finally, "but you're thinking too small, and you're taking too many risks. The kind of family jobs you're pulling might net you a few hundred, but they also make enemies who won't stop looking until they find you. What you need is to scale up, hit targets with real money, people who won't even miss what you take." Doyle's proposition was seductive. He claimed to have connections with a network of confidence men who operated throughout the mid-Atlantic states, targeting wealthy merchants and politicians whose illegal or embarrassing activities made them unlikely to report thefts to authorities. The work would be more sophisticated but potentially more profitable, and Joshua's unique appearance would make him invaluable for certain types of operations. But accepting Doyle's offer would mean abandoning the rural, family-based schemes that had sustained Joshua for 4 years. More troubling, it would require him to work with partners who might eventually discover that his childlike appearance was matched by very adult capabilities for violence, capabilities he hoped never to reveal. Joshua's partnership with Marcus Doyle began promisingly but quickly revealed complications that neither man had anticipated. Their first collaboration, targeting a wealthy grain merchant who was secretly selling spoiled wheat to immigrant families, succeeded beyond their expectations. Joshua's role was to pose as the merchant's nephew visiting from the country, while Doyle posed as a business associate. Over the course of 3 days, they gained access to the merchant's office and discovered not only substantial cash reserves, but also detailed records of his illegal activities that were worth a small fortune in blackmail potential. The success, however, came at a cost. During the operation, Joshua was forced to maintain his childlike persona for extended periods while interacting with adults who might have exposed his deception. The strain of constantly modulating his voice, controlling his facial expressions, and suppressing his natural adult mannerisms left him exhausted and increasingly paranoid about making mistakes. More troubling still, Doyle began asking pointed questions about Joshua's background and physical condition. "I've known plenty of small men," Doyle observed during one of their planning sessions. "But there's something different about you. It's not just your size, it's like you stopped aging altogether. That kind of thing doesn't happen naturally, not without reasons that might interest the wrong sort of people." Joshua deflected such inquiries with vague references to childhood illness and family curse. But he could see that Doyle's suspicions were growing. The criminal was too experienced to accept simple explanations for such an obvious anomaly, and his continued probing suggested that he might eventually demand the complete truth about Joshua's condition. The situation became critical when news of the Salem County manhunt reached Philadelphia through law enforcement channels. Sheriff Fricks had expanded his investigation beyond New Jersey, contacting constables and sheriffs throughout the region with detailed descriptions of Joshua and his known methods. Worse still, the reward for his capture had grown to $75 as more victims came forward with stories of similar thefts. "There's a boy they're looking for," Doyle mentioned casually during a conversation at the Anchor and Chain. "Seems he's been running confidence games on farming families throughout New Jersey. Small fella looks maybe 12 years old. Been doing this for years according to the circulars." He paused to study Joshua's reaction carefully. "Funny thing is the description matches someone I know pretty well." The confrontation Joshua had been dreading finally came on January 15, 1842, during what should have been a routine planning meeting for their next operation. Doyle arrived at their usual meeting place carrying a copy of the wanted circular that Sheriff Hendricks had distributed throughout the region. The illustration, though crude, was recognizable enough to leave no doubt about Joshua's identity. Joshua Bennett, Doyle read aloud, also known as Joseph Crawford, Timothy Walsh, and Michael Fletcher, wanted for theft, confidence schemes, and suspected kidnapping in Salem County, New Jersey, distinguished by unusually small stature and youthful appearance despite estimated age of 30 or more years. He set the paper down and looked directly at Joshua with eyes that held no warmth. "The reward is up to $100 now. That's more money than we've made in 3 jobs together." The threat was clear, but Joshua had survived too much to surrender without a fight. "You turn me in and you lose the best partner you'll ever have," he said, allowing his adult intelligence to show through his childlike facade for the first time. "Besides, you think the authorities will just hand over the reward and forget about your own activities? They'll want to know how you found me, what you've been doing with me, and why you didn't come forward sooner." The argument had merit, but Joshua could see that Doyle was calculating risks and benefits with the cold precision of a man who had betrayed partners before. More troubling still, Joshua realized that his unique value as a criminal was becoming a liability. Too many people now knew about the boy who never grew, and his distinctive appearance made him increasingly easy to track. The resolution came in a way that neither man expected. On the night of January 18th, as they prepared to execute a plan targeting a corrupt bank president, Doyle made a fatal error in judgment. He had been drinking heavily during the afternoon, building courage for what he had decided would be his betrayal of Joshua to the authorities. But alcohol affected his normally sharp instincts, and he failed to notice that Joshua had become aware of his intentions. The confrontation occurred in an alley behind the Anchor and Chain, where Doyle had arranged to meet a Philadelphia constable who specialized in capturing wanted fugitives. Joshua arrived early and concealed himself in the shadows, watching as Doyle paced nervously while waiting for his contact to appear. When the constable finally arrived, Joshua heard enough of their conversation to confirm his worst fears. "The boy will be here any minute," Doyle was saying. "Remember, he's stronger than he looks and smarter than most grown men. Don't let his appearance fool you into thinking this will be easy." What happened next would haunt Joshua for the rest of his life, though it would not be the last time he killed to protect his freedom. As the constable positioned himself to ambush Joshua, Doyle continued providing details about his partner's habits and weaknesses. The betrayal was complete and unforgivable, demanding a response that would eliminate the immediate threat while sending a message to anyone else who might consider similar treachery. Joshua's attack was swift, silent, and devastatingly effective. Using a technique he had learned during his youth in the Pine Barrens, where survival sometimes required killing wild animals with minimal noise, he approached Doyle from behind and delivered a precise blow to the base of the skull with a heavy piece of broken brick. Doyle collapsed without a sound, his betrayal ending before it could be completed. The constable, hearing movement in the alley, called out for Doyle but received no response. When he ventured deeper into the darkness to investigate, Joshua was ready for him. The lawman's lantern provided enough light to make him an easy target, and his unfamiliarity with the alley's layout gave Joshua every advantage he needed. The second killing was messier than the first, requiring more direct violence to overcome a man trained in physical confrontation. But Joshua's desperation gave him strength, and his small size allowed him to attack from angles the constable couldn't effectively defend. When it was over, both men lay dead in the muddy alley, their blood mixing with the rain that had begun to fall. Joshua took several minutes to search both bodies, recovering not only his own money that Doyle had been carrying, but also the constable's official papers and a small amount of additional cash. Most importantly, he retrieved the wanted circular bearing his description along with any other documents that might help authorities trace his movements through Philadelphia. The double murder marked a turning point in Joshua's criminal career. No longer was he simply a confidence man who preyed on trusting families. He had become a killer who would eliminate anyone who threatened his freedom. The transformation both liberated and terrified him, opening possibilities for more audacious crimes while creating new dangers that would follow him wherever he fled. Joshua's flight from Philadelphia took him through the winter landscape of Pennsylvania and into the mountainous regions of western Maryland, where he hoped to disappear among the isolated communities that rarely saw strangers or asked inconvenient questions. But the double murder in Philadelphia had attracted attention from law enforcement agencies throughout the region, and Sheriff Hendricks had expanded his investigation to include federal marshals who specialized in tracking criminals across state lines. The manhunt intensified when the Philadelphia constable's body was discovered 3 days after the killings. The brutal nature of the crime, combined with evidence that the lawman had been investigating the wanted fugitive from New Jersey, convinced authorities that Joshua Bennett was far more dangerous than his childlike appearance suggested. Rewards for his capture now totaled nearly $200, and wanted posters bearing his description appeared in post offices and taverns from Baltimore to Pittsburgh. Joshua's next mistake came from overconfidence and desperation. Running low on funds and struggling to find safe shelter in the unfamiliar terrain of western Maryland, he decided to attempt one more family-based confidence scheme before abandoning his traditional methods entirely. The target he selected was the Pechin family, prosperous German immigrants who operated a successful grain mill near the town of Cumberland. Henrik Pechin was a man of 45 who had built his success through careful planning and suspicious attention to detail, exactly the wrong sort of mark for Joshua's increasingly sloppy methods. When Joshua appeared at the Pechin mill claiming to be an orphan boy seeking work, Heinrich immediately noticed inconsistencies in his story that a more trusting soul might have overlooked. "This boy speaks like an educated man," Heinrich confided to his wife Anna during a private conversation conducted in German. "His hands show no signs of real farm work, and he knows too much about business practices for someone his supposed age. Something is very wrong here." Anna Pechin, a practical woman who had helped her husband build their prosperity through shrewd judgment of character, agreed with her husband's assessment. But their decision to investigate Joshua's background more carefully sealed the fate of their entire family. Henrich's inquiries in Cumberland revealed that no one in the area had heard of the family tragedy that Joshua claimed had left him orphaned. More troubling, a traveling merchant mentioned that a boy matching Joshua's description was wanted by law enforcement agencies in connection with thefts and suspected murders in Philadelphia and New Jersey. The confrontation came on February 3, 1842, during a snowstorm that had trapped Joshua at the Pechin mill for 3 days. Heinrich had sent word to the Cumberland sheriff requesting assistance in detaining a suspected criminal, but the weather made travel impossible and left the family isolated, with the man they now knew to be extremely dangerous. "We know who you are," Heinrich announced during the evening meal, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions. "The authorities have been notified and they will be here as soon as the weather permits travel. Until then, you will remain in the mill under our supervision." Joshua's reaction was swift and merciless. The carefully maintained facade of childhood innocence disappeared entirely as he revealed the adult intelligence and capacity for violence that had always lurked beneath his deceptive appearance. Using a carving knife from the dinner table, he killed Heinrich before the older man could react to the transformation. Anna Pechin's screams brought their 2 children running from the next room, 12-year-old Wilhelm and 9-year-old Greta. Joshua's decision to kill them as well was coldly practical rather than psychopathic. They had seen too much and could identify him to authorities. But the murders of the children marked his complete transformation from competence man to mass killer, crossing a line that would make any future attempts at normal criminal activity impossible. The Pechin killings were discovered 5 days later, when neighbors became concerned about the family's absence from Sunday church services. The brutal scene that greeted the sheriff and his deputies convinced even the most skeptical observers that Joshua Bennett was a predator of unprecedented cunning and violence. The massacre at the Pechin mill triggered the largest manhunt in Maryland's history up to that time. Federal marshals, state militiamen, and local pauses scoured the mountains and valleys of western Maryland, following every reported sighting and investigating every possible hiding place. But Joshua had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him, leaving behind only speculation about his methods and his ultimate destination. Sheriff Ricks, arriving in Cumberland to coordinate the search effort, studied the crime scene with the growing certainty that they were dealing with a criminal unlike any he had encountered before. The precision of the killings, the complete absence of witnesses, and the killer's ability to disappear without leaving tracks in fresh snow suggested planning and execution that went far beyond ordinary criminal capabilities. This wasn't random violence. Ricks explained to the assembled law enforcement officers. Every aspect of these murders was calculated to eliminate threats and cover his escape route. We're hunting someone who thinks several moves ahead and won't hesitate to kill anyone who gets in his way. The search continued for 3 months, expanding to include areas as far west as Ohio and as far south as Virginia. Reported sightings came from dozens of communities, but each investigation revealed only mistaken identity or deliberate deception by attention seekers hoping to claim the substantial reward. The truth was that Joshua Bennett had made his most audacious transformation yet. Using money stolen from his victims and documents taken from the dead Philadelphia constable, he had purchased passage on a freight wagon traveling to St. Louis, where the expanding frontier offered anonymity and opportunity for those willing to abandon their past completely. In Missouri, Joshua adopted a new identity as Thomas Mitchell, the adult brother of a fictional boy who had supposedly died during the journey west. His small stature and youthful appearance, which had been such advantages in his family-based confidence schemes, now became liabilities in a land where physical strength and obvious maturity commanded respect. But Joshua adapted with the same cunning that had sustained his criminal career, finding new ways to exploit human weaknesses and capitalize on others' trust. The story of Joshua Bennett's crimes in Salem County and his subsequent flight became legend throughout New Jersey and the surrounding states. Families began scrutinizing unexpected visitors with suspicious attention, and the tradition of automatically sheltering orphaned children gradually gave way to more careful verification of identities and backgrounds. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire affair was how completely Joshua had vanished after the Pechin murders. Despite the massive search effort and the substantial rewards offered for his capture, no credible trace of him was ever found. He had simply disappeared into the vastness of America's expanding frontier, leaving behind only questions about how many other victims he might claim before his inevitable capture or death. Sheriff Hendricks never stopped believing that Joshua Bennett was still alive somewhere, still preying on unsuspecting families who had no reason to suspect that the child's face might hide a killer's mind. In his final report on the case, written 20 years after the Salem County investigation began, Ricks included a warning that proved prophetic. The criminal known as Joshua Bennett represents a new type of predator whose methods and motivations challenge everything we believe about the nature of trust and innocence. Until such individuals are recognized and stopped, no family can consider itself truly safe from deception. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Salem County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The case files remained open for decades, gathering dust in courthouse basement and sheriff's offices throughout the mid-Atlantic region. Occasionally, reports would surface of similar crimes, always involving small childlike figures who gained families' trust before vanishing with their valuables. But whether these incidents represented Joshua Bennett's continued activities or the work of imitators inspired by his methods remained forever unclear. Some historians believe that Joshua Bennett's story represents one of the earliest documented cases of what modern criminologists would recognize as a serial predator, someone whose crimes escalated from theft to murder as circumstances demanded increasingly violent solutions to practical problems. Others argue that his case demonstrates the vulnerability of 19th-century communities to deception by individuals willing to exploit society's most cherished values of charity and family protection. What remains certain is that the boy who never grew changed forever. How Americans thought about trust, strangers, and the possibility that evil might wear the most innocent of faces His legacy lives on in the caution that parents still teach their children about talking to strangers and in the background checks that modern society requires before allowing anyone access to our homes and families. This mystery shows us how even our most generous impulses can be twisted against us by those who understand human nature well enough to exploit our best intentions. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.